Okay, so, mutualism. What is mutualism? Mutualism is an anarchist philosophy that seeks a society dominated by worker co-ops and self-employed individuals. It is a branch of anarcho-socialism alongside its generally more well-known cousin anarcho-communism. The difference between the two is that anarcho-communism doesn't use currency, while mutualism does. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally do not feel like the government is really negatively affecting my day-to-day ordinary life in any significant manner. Maybe that might have to do with some white privileges that I might have, with not having to worry as much about police brutality. Maybe it has to do with the fact that I'm not always employed, and so not always having to put up with deductions. But in general, with the exception of not being able to split lanes on a motorcycle, I feel a lot more aggrieved and put upon by the fact that I have to spend most of my day living inside of a miniature dictatorship, being told what I can say, how I can dress, what my activities are going to be for the day, how I can use the bathroom, and so forth. Being forced to maintain a general state of professionalism even outside of the workplace, where one off-color Facebook post could get me fired. Being afraid of having any sort of political discussions at work for fear of getting fired. And of course, if I am fired, then I am destitute and out on the street, basically. Now, someone could say, well, you could always get a new job, yes, but you can't avoid having a job. You can't avoid having a boss. You can't avoid having to subject yourself to these little miniature dictators that can make or break your entire existence. And what kind of a society are we creating when the only way to escape the ravenous clutches of these petty dictators is to escape into the woods and eke out a bare modicum of existence alongside other people that have chosen the same route? And really, who has more freedom of speech on a day-to-day basis? Honestly, a guy sitting at home on welfare pretty much doing what he wants with the exception of some financial restrictions on what he can achieve on a day-to-day basis, or someone that works a traditional job for 8 to 10 hours a day? Now, I would agree that if everyone were self-employed, and that was possible, we wouldn't need mutualism. We wouldn't need any form of socialism, in fact, because the workers would not be being exploited. And in fact, David Friedman, the most famous anarcho-capitalist intellectual after Murray Rothbard, actually has theorized that this may even be possible on a purely free market. But I'm not entirely certain of that, and so I activate workers' co-ops as the way to go for those who cannot or don't want to be self-employed. One thing I want to get across very strongly in all of this is that unless we have an economy in which jobs compete for workers rather than workers competing for jobs, whether you call that system anarcho-socialist, anarcho-capitalist, social democratic, or what have you, most people cannot truly be said to have a wide variety of options when it comes to which one of the dictators you choose to live under. I hope that I am able to get across that mutualism is the best solution for achieving such an economy, in which workers compete for jobs instead of the other way around. In order for this abstract idea of workers having an endless array of options that capitalists often talk about in terms of how we make a living to be a concrete reality for most people, we would have to have a society in which it is just as easy to find a co-op to work for, or to go into business for yourself, or to live on a self-sufficient homestead as it is to find a traditional job. But we don't have that. A very prescient argument I heard recently is that the only way a contract can be said to be not made under duress is if both parties stand to gain and lose roughly a similar amount from having the contract or not having the contract, and that both parties can walk away any time and they're more or less okay. I think it's clear that this is not what is happening when you take a job in this system or rent from a landlord. At the risk of sounding flippant, most of my main problems with anarcho-communism are fairly similar to the problems ANCAPs often have, and my main concerns with anarcho-capitalism are similar to the concerns often raised by ANCOMs. So, what are my problems with anarcho-communism, the most popular form of left-wing anarchism? Well, to start off, I'm going to do something a little unexpected, and something that some of you listening to this might consider a little unnecessary or even overkill if you're an ANCOM listening to this, and explain anarcho-communism in advance in specific detail, as I think a lot of ANCOMs unfortunately don't know how to explain it properly. Anarcho-communism is far and away one of the most unique and different economic systems ever devised, and if you're hearing about it for the first time, a lot of people might think you're just making shit up. So this is ANCOM in a nutshell, and I did used to be one, so I think I know what I'm talking about here pretty much. So the workers own the means of production, same as mutualism, and there's this factory, let's say, that produces shoes. In order to figure out how many and what type of shoes ought to be produced, instead of using money like mutualism, the workers at the shoe factory take surveys over a long period of time of all the people in the general area as to what type of shoes they would like to have and how many, and then they just make those shoes. And then they ship them out to all the local clothing stores. And let's say that you'd like to get a new pair of shoes. You walk into the local clothing store, find a pair that you like, and then take them up to the front desk, and then now you own those shoes. That's all there is to it. There's no money involved. The worker at the clothing store simply takes a note down that they are now down one pair of brown leather shoes and makes a note to get some more in the future. This is a very elegant system, and a very attractive one as well, with a deeply egalitarian impulse behind it. No one person or group of people has the ability to have any greater chance of amassing a ton of consumer goods compared to anyone else. Everyone has the exact same opportunities to consume goods and services, perhaps excepting some cases of geographic isolation or some kind of disability that would prevent this. Perfect equality of opportunity, without any need to enforce equality of outcome. Equality of outcome is not the goal. There is no massive state committee forcing the various shoe manufacturers to manufacture things based on what they think the quote-unquote good of society is. The shoe manufacturers and clothing store workers decide how many and what type of shoes you can have, not any sort of state bureaucracy. So what are my problems with this ideology? Well, I'm very skeptical of the idea that we would be able to accurately measure and predict the amount and type of consumer goods that people would want and produce them without the significant possibility of shortages if we do not have market prices as mutualism would. Of course, there's the possibility of shortages under any economic system, and certainly a much higher possibility under some kind of state socialist regime, but nonetheless I don't think that there is any real substitute for market prices. More specifically, I believe that demand would tend to outstrip supply in a significant number of cases. What do I mean? Well, for example, I am not a car guy. I'm not particularly interested in cars. But if you told me that the only thing I needed to do in order to get a shiny new Lamborghini was to put an order for one and wait for it to arrive, you bet I would jump on that chance, if only to try it out for a few years. And you can bet that most men between the ages of 16 and 45 would do the same thing. So there is no natural sort of ceiling on the amount of people that can have a Lamborghini and own one and enjoy one. There is no natural limit to this in terms of, if you can't afford it, then you don't get one. And so the system would fall apart because there are simply too many examples of this particular situation that I could think of, where demand would significantly outstrip supply. Perhaps an anarcho-communist society would simply have far fewer luxury goods than other societies. This is something that is commonly brought up by a lot of ANCOM thinkers, although not by a majority, I would say, necessarily, both in the old days and currently. See Peter Gelderloos's Anarchy Works for an example of this viewpoint. But then that leads to the problem of who would actually want to sign up to be part of this society if that were the case. Now, the ANCAP straw man is deployed when they say that no one would work under anarcho-communism. Obviously they would work. The incentive to work is that you live in a society in which everything is provided to you without a price tag, which would obviously be an enormous draw to a lot of people. And if you simply refuse to work at any job and you're not ill or dealing with a significant mental illness and can be verified to be in a treatment plan of some kind currently, obviously the commune would kick you out, and that's perfectly fine. So the issue is not that no one would work, of course they would. It's just that I think that people would tend to fight for the jobs which are considered to be both not too physically strenuous and also particularly engaging, fulfilling, and creative. Stuff like music, poetry, and so on. Right-wingers love to talk about how there's too many liberal arts students for the amount of humanities jobs available. For the kinds of jobs in academia, education generally, journalism, research, and advocacy that are related to the topics those kinds of degrees cover. I can't see how this kind of problem wouldn't just be massively overinflated in an anarcho-communist society, and extended to lots of other industries and professions that are seen as desirable, like art, music, and certain more creative, higher-level white-collar positions. Now, would it necessarily be the case that the garbage wouldn't get taken out anywhere because no one would ever volunteer for those jobs? Well, probably not everywhere, but I can definitely imagine it happening in some places, especially in the beginning of the whole thing. I can also imagine someone taking this in a slightly different direction and focusing on the working hours as a way to break the system and take advantage of it. Someone could insist that 30 minutes a day is more than enough time in any job that they might have, regardless of what is necessary to keep the community running. So, in a way, this is just an extension of the idea of shortages and demand outstripping supply, but this time for jobs instead of goods and services. This problem is compounded even more when you bring self-employment into the picture. Now, literally no anarchist I've ever met, whether they're ANCAP, Mutualist, or Anarcho-Communist, has said that they have a problem with people being self-employed. Mutualists and ANCAPs, obviously, you produce things and you sell them for money. In Anarcho-Communism, as far as I understand it, you would produce something or provide a service on your own, and as long as you are actually doing that consistently, you would be considered a member of the commune in good standing, and would be given the same access to the products of the various syndicates. But how do we decide how much a self-employed person would need to produce? Could I, hypothetically, make shitty stick figure drawings or just post memes for 30 minutes a day and still be considered in good standing, aka not a shirker? And on the flip side, if I am contributing something more legitimate, like, say, jewelry, on a regular basis, am I going to be forced to work at an unreasonable pace? Just some food for thought. For more information, I think ANCAPs, ANCOMs, and Mutualists all would benefit from slowly working through the very long, detailed proposals in the video entitled Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work, by the up-and-coming ANCOM YouTuber Lucky Black Cat. Despite the more general title, this video is solely in relation to anarcho-communist proposals, and also Bakunin's anarcho-collectivism, which she renames to NTC socialism, or non-transferable currency socialism, which I think was a good choice. You can also check out the point-by-point response video by the centrist social democratish streamer Econoboy. There's no mutualism section in the video, but I don't think there is really any reason for there to be. It doesn't really fit in with the point of the video. Now on to anarcho-capitalism. Now, my main problems with anarcho-capitalism are a little less fleshed out. But of course, the main worry that people would have with anarcho-capitalism, other than the little mini-dictatorships of hierarchical businesses that would predominate, is that the various private defense organizations and private courts could cartelize and try to become a state. Now, I think it is perfectly reasonable that when someone is researching anarcho-capitalism, that they might try to put themselves in the mindset of a fictional private police cartel leader that is corrupt and trying to become a state, and try to experiment and visualize the strategies that they would use to try and do this, in order to sort of test the system of anarcho-capitalism that they've been presented with, and probe it for weaknesses, so to speak. I think this is a perfectly understandable thing to do. And I think most of my problems with anarcho-capitalism deal with the idea that anarcho-capitalists greatly overestimate the speed at which information travels. Now, what do I mean by this? I think that first off, that it would make a lot of sense that a particular private police cartel would be willing to take the initial hit in their finances from people discovering that they are trying to become a state, and naturally withdrawing their funding for a while in order to get to the eventual goal of taking over resources and territory and becoming a state. I think that this is absolutely possible. They could potentially secretly invest in and capture the local media to try and draw attention away from what they were doing. And it's perfectly possible that maybe around 15% of their customer base or more might still somehow be unaware of what's going on, and still be paying for their services without any awareness of the fact that their courts and defense organizations that they've been patronizing are now incredibly corrupt. If you're living in an incredibly isolated area, or perhaps you're a very elderly person, you may not have a lot of information about what's going on, or even a lot of options for police and court services in your area, and so you are unfortunately going to still be paying the monthly premium to this corrupt police organization. It's almost as if ANCAPs believe, and I know they don't literally believe this, but they almost act as if it is true, that if a CEO of a private court or police organization even thinks about trying to become a state, their electricity will be immediately shut off, and their water will be shut off, and their guns will jam, and everything will perfectly fall into place to thwart their efforts, when in fact information travels a lot slower than people think. Now, of course, there is always the possibility that the people will be able to rise up and overthrow this potential state, and I think that's a very strong possibility that they will be able to do so. But I don't want to be set up in a situation where this is very likely to happen on a regular basis. My other problems with anarcho-capitalism are more peripheral. So, for example, I don't think I would enjoy living in a society where all roads were tolls, let alone where the company I was paying changed every 7 miles. I would much prefer living in a society where I had to pay a single lump sum of money every year to use the roads, or maybe the roads would be funded by a donation. I don't think that having this kind of arrangement would undermine the entire point of anarcho-capitalism, though, if we're defining the core of the ideology as one in which law and justice are vested in various competing courts and police organizations. I think that's perfectly compatible with that type of system. I also definitely wouldn't want prisons to be for profit. I think that's just a recipe for the various companies involved shutting out any kind of transparency and prisoners being abused physically and emotionally. And maybe also there would be a similar communal monetary pool for healthcare, although I don't see that as being necessary for education or consumer safety watchdog groups. So, what is the anarcho-socialist alternative to the ANCAP system of dispute resolution that mutualists and anarcho-communists hold in common? It's a traditional proposal going all the way back to the beginning of anarchism in the mid-19th century. The decisions would be made collectively on a direct democratic basis by everyone in the general area where no one has any more decision-making power than anyone else. One person, one vote. I think that these types of organizations have very little chance of becoming a state for many reasons. One is that no one would truly be in charge, quote-unquote, because no one would have any more decision-making power than anyone else. Decisions are made as a whole, by everyone in the particular general area, and there is no one that can force their decisions on the General Assembly of people. Perhaps they might elect certain people to carry out certain specific tasks, but only temporarily and used when absolutely necessary, and they would be immediately recallable if they do something corrupt. And many of these offices could also be filled by sortition or random selection. And these assemblies, as I'll call them for the remainder of my discussion, will be decentralized to the absolute minimum number of people that still function, based around Dunbar's number, which is a fairly popular scientific concept that lots of people from lots of different radical political groups have sort of discovered and applied independently of each other in their own specific contexts, which I think is really interesting, which is about 100 to 150 people, the maximum number of people that your brain can sort of conceptualize as being real people with their own thoughts and emotions, and not just sort of out there statistics. And so it would be carried out like that. Every assembly of 100 to 150 would be completely sovereign. This would be the base unit of political organization, and one assembly in the area could not simply override the decisions of another assembly in their sovereign territory, even if they were able to get all of the other assemblies in the area on board with doing so, unless the one assembly in question is aggressing against other groups or their own people, of course. So individual assemblies are sovereign, and also individual people are sovereign, because you must be given the option to opt out and move to another anarcho-socialist community if you don't like the kinds of decisions that are being made, or to an ANCAP community or any other type of community you could think of. And any assembly that refused to respect a person's wishes in this regard would be considered corrupt, and the other nearby assemblies would unite to stop them. Anarcho-socialist assemblies are not statist, because, first of all, you have the right to opt out, that's a big one. But other than that, there are things about the fundamental workings of anarcho-socialist assemblies that make them not states. Like, what I mean is, it's not just a voluntary state, it's not a state, period. So you, as an ANCAP, recognize and believe that anarcho-capitalist private courts and defense agencies are not states, because they are totally dependent around the consent and funding of their customers. They do not have a life outside of what their customers can give them, and they're constantly rising and falling directly as a result of shifting preferences in the market. This is exactly how anarcho-socialist assemblies would work. Decisions are made by a large group of people voicing their opinions in the marketplace of ideas, and there is no one that you can point to that is in charge, as I said. No one that can stand up at the front of the room and demand that others follow what they believe. So I'm already willing to sort of break for my fellow anarcho-socialists and agree that you are not a statist douchebag. So be willing to listen to me when I tell you that we are not statists either. Of course, these assemblies are not 100% immune from someone trying to become a state, but that is impossible to stop completely, just as it is impossible to stop completely an anarcho-capitalist corrupt private police or defense organization from trying to become a state. All you can do is unite as one and not allow them to do so and fight back. That's how this works. Now, of course, we're all extremely concerned about the importance of minority rights. We're extremely concerned with making sure that minority voices in decision-making are heard and respected, and that they don't feel aggrieved or oppressed. We don't want everything to just be a 51% to 49% vote. Certain things would need a higher threshold in order to pass, and of course certain basic rights would be considered inviolable and not up for debate. There are a myriad of possible strategies and ways we could use to try and ensure that minority voices are heard and respected. Robert's Rules of Order, the Quaker model of decision-making, the liquid democracy system, and/or ranked choice voting, which is very popular, New England town hall strategies, anything you could possibly think of right now in your head listening to this to allow for legitimate debate and deliberation to go forward and make sure that minority voices are heard could be adopted and integrated into the anarcho-socialist model. And any alternate electoral process, such as ranked choice voting for example, could also be extended to the process of electing delegates as well as voting on policy. Now, I want to add on to this, we still recognize that some people have more skills and experience with certain specific things than others. Like the idea of temporarily establishing a group of 5 people who are skilled with installing power lines, for example, out of an entire electricians cooperative, let's say, who have been elected by the workers of that particular electricians cooperative because of their ability to tell which trees need to be cut down and what height to make the telephone poles. Something like that doesn't completely undermine the entire system of anarcho-socialism. In the same way that certain collective actions done by all of the people in the general area, regardless of which private courts or defense agencies they subscribe to, would not necessarily invalidate the entire concept of anarcho-capitalism. Neither are the ideas of anarcho-socialism invalidated just because most people would agree that the janitor shouldn't get a say in how brain surgeries are done. But unlike what we have today, the janitor would get a say in every possible decision that you could think of that he's actually knowledgeable and qualified to talk about. And in fact, anarcho-socialism would free up the surgeon to make his own decisions about how surgery should proceed without having to kowtow to the will of some overpaid, faceless administrative bureaucratic class. It's a lot better to have the janitor participating in every decision that he's actually qualified to talk about and doesn't involve people's health and safety than creating a rigid structure where only those in power can make the decisions. In comparison, I think a much bigger problem would be the sheer amount of time out of the day it would take to go to all these meetings and make all these decisions. But we have the internet, we can do it that way, and of course, as anarchists, we believe that it is immoral to try and dictate every little thing that people are allowed to do in society and control their lives. So meetings would be kept to a minimum to only deal with the things that absolutely need to be dealt with. And of course, as I said, there are lots of ways to make decision-making efficient and quick without compromising minority rights. The procedures for holding the meetings efficiently would improve over time, of course. And one thing that I think is important to bring up finally is an issue that is very much underrated and not so talked about by most ideological groups around the world, and that anarcho-socialists in comparison have sort of taken up as one of their pet issues, which is shortening the working day, full stop, whether that be in a cooperative setting or a hierarchical setting. That there's no reason for us to work as much as we have been, and that there's aspects that we can point to in how the current system operates that push people towards working more than they need to. Imagine how freeing that would be in terms of people actually being able to go to these direct democratic meetings and put their effort and energy towards them. Keynes thought that we would achieve a 15-hour workweek by 2030. Ever since the beginning of socialism, before Marx, before even Proudhon, this idea is something that has come and gone through various sectors of the socialist movement at different points in history, Ideas that maybe we could shorten the work week through automation, or in my particular opinion, it's more important to think about looking at it from a non-technological perspective. But this, alongside the use of the internet, is to me the most effective way to answer the charge of the direct democratic assemblies taking up too much time and sort of becoming a drag, and becoming sort of this authoritarian thing that people might feel resentful towards that doesn't really improve their lives. For more details on the, let's say, parliamentary procedure of anarcho-socialist direct democratic assemblies, check out the video After the Revolution by the Ancom YouTuber Anarch, which I'll mirror on my channel, and I'll also include the link to the original video in the description of the mirror if you'd like to check that out. So what makes the mutualist movement different? What makes us stand out? And what do we have to offer to the broader anarchist community? Well, one of the most important mutualist concepts is something called vulgar libertarianism, and this refers to the following. It seems that right libertarians have trouble remembering from one moment to the next whether or not the current system is a corporate capitalist cronyist nightmare or a genuine free market based around fierce competition, leading to the best possible products at the best possible prices. Let me explain this by bringing attention to a particular hot-button issue in our society today: sweatshops. The traditional right libertarian argument in favor of sweatshops goes like this. Who are we to take away someone's job? Working at a sweatshop is certainly better than what a lot of people in, for example, Bangladesh were doing before, scavenging for resources in junkyards and along rivers, wading through sewage and that sort of thing. Literally modern-day hunting and gathering. But sweatshops are created by Western companies, working together with corrupt third-world governments to just seize massive amounts of land and give people no choice but to work for those companies. Do you feel compelled to defend Walmart? Because, well, at least they're giving people jobs and providing people with goods and services at cheap prices. Well, Walmart wouldn't exist without government intervention. What I mean by this is that they are reliant on the government subsidizing their shipping costs, without which they would crumble. I mean, just look at the concept of corporate personhood and limited liability corporations in and of itself. Just abolishing that set of laws would pretty much be dynamite to corporate power just by itself. But let's keep exploring the concept of transportation subsidies. Now, some of this gets a little granular, so I'll just quote Kevin Carson, the most important modern mutualist thinker, at length here. Existing problems of excess energy consumption, pollution, big box stores, the car culture, and suburban sprawl results from the massive political pressure that has already been applied over the past several decades to redesign our cities. The root of all these problems that people find so objectionable is state intervention in the marketplace. In particular, subsidies to transportation have probably done more than any other factor, with the possible exception of intellectual property law, to determine the present shape of the American corporate economy. Currently predominating firm sizes and market areas are the result of government subsidies to transportation. Powerful business interests have used their political influence since the beginning of American history to secure government funding for internal improvements, quote-unquote. The real turning point was the government's role in creating the railroad system from the mid-19th century on. The national railroad system, as we know it, was almost entirely a creature of the state. The federal railroad land grants included not only the rights of way for the actual railroads, but extended 15-mile tracks on both sides. As the lines were completed, this adjoining land became prime real estate and skyrocketed in value. As new communities sprung up along the routes, every house and business in town was built on land acquired from the railroads. According to Gabriel Kolko's account in The Triumph of Conservatism, and this is a very important historical work that even a lot of ANCAPs praise as being very prescient on this issue, that talks about the rise of the progressive era economy in the first few decades of the 20th century, quote, the large trusts at the turn of the 20th century were not able to maintain their market share against more efficient smaller firms. The stabilization of most industries on an oligopoly pattern was possible in the end only with the additional help of the quote-unquote progressive era's anti-competitive regulations. The fact that the trusts were so unstable, despite the cartelizing effects of tariffs and patents as a way to maintain them, speaks volumes about the level of state intervention necessary to maintain monopoly capitalism. But without the combined influence of tariffs, patents, and railroad subsidies, it is unlikely that they would have been able to make even a credible attempt to organize such trusts in the first place. And later on, when talking about the modern day, Carson continues with this. Virtually 100% of roadbed damage to highways is caused by heavy trucks. After repeated liberalization of maximum weight restrictions, far beyond the heaviest conceivable weight the interstate roadbeds were originally designed to support, fuel taxes fail miserably at capturing from big rig operators the cost of pavement damage caused by higher axle loads, and truckers have been successful at scrapping weight distance user charges in all but a few western states, where the push for repeal continues. So only about half the revenue of the Highway Trust Fund comes from fees or fuel taxes on the trucking industry, and the rest is externalized on private automobiles. So, without these government privileges, we would have a society of small businesses and self-employed people producing for local communities, without these big-box stores. And maybe not everything you buy would be made within 100 miles of you, but we certainly wouldn't be exploiting extremely poor people halfway around the world to have the same standard of living we have now. Now, anyone could take apart any number of individual sections of arguments, previously and as I continue here, when it comes to specific government policies and the effect that they would have on the market if they were abolished. But I hope that I'm at least offering up a potential alternative to the current system and painting a broad picture of what things could be like in the absence of the corporate privileges. So with that in mind, let's keep going. Patents. Now, patents generally seem to be the one example of government artificially increasing inequality that ANCAPs are most familiar with. I mean, Murray Rothbard wrote a lot about patents, so did a lot of newer ANCAPs like Stefan Kinsella, and for that I'm very grateful, and I definitely agree with a lot of their positions on this issue. And I hope that I can show that they're even more dangerous and destructive than a lot of ANCAPs and ANCOMs even realize. Murray Rothbard said in Man, Economy and State, "Patents, therefore, are grants of exclusive monopoly privilege by the state and are invasions of property rights on the market." Up until the early 1970s, Italy did not recognize drug patents. A result of this was that the British National Health Service was charged 40 times more for the components of Librium and Valium than their Italian counterparts, who did not recognize patents. Edwin Prindle, a corporate patent lawyer, wrote in 1906, "Patents are the best and most effective means of controlling competition. They occasionally give absolute command of the market, enabling their owner to name the price without regard to the cost of production. Patents are the only legal form of absolute monopoly." Healthcare. So, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were these things called friendly societies that provided medical care for as little as $1 to $2 a year in money of that era. Normally, if you went through the mainstream medical system, this would be the cost of one single consultation by a doctor. A group of working-class people would start an association and then pay a yearly or monthly fee into the association's treasury to use the services. They would contract with doctors to receive their medical services, and the doctors would be paid a regular salary. There was incentive for people using the services to make sure that their fellow members weren't abusing the system and overusing the physician's services, because otherwise premiums would go up. And this was totally destroyed by the governments in the Western world, and by their cronies in the health industry that wanted monopoly control. So this shows the possibility of a mutualist healthcare system that avoids problems with both the current system and the government healthcare system, the forced taxation and centralized inefficiencies of the latter, and the massive cost to the consumer of the former, leading to people avoiding going to the doctor because of the cost. Loosening licensing requirements would also decrease the cost of healthcare, as many intelligent right-wing libertarians have also pointed out, as would getting rid of patents for medical technology and allowing small companies to make their own versions of MRI machines, for example. We could also talk at length about zoning laws, squatters' rights, or other aspects of licensing. For example, the New York City taxis that cost an enormous amount in order to buy your way into that market. And of course, as I mentioned before in the section on sweatshops, there's particular policies in certain countries where the big corporations work with the state to force people into their arms and push people off of the land that they've owned since time immemorial. Another thing to keep in mind as well, and this is one thing that I've seen a lot of ANCAPs mention before, is that virtually any example of something being quote-unquote privatized, whenever that term comes up in the media, really, that's just the government auctioning off a service or a piece of land to certain politically connected capitalists. There's almost no situations that have arisen in the modern world where the government just gives up control of some service or piece of property and just allows people to bid for it sort of organically, slowly on the free market. So almost every instance of something being privatized that leftists can point to as making things worse, as increasing poverty and inequality, was a situation of government-sponsored privilege. In the same breath as all of this, let's not forget about the Fed. The Fed is a private bankers' cartel, and you can go back and forth about what to do about it, per se. I've met some people that are in favor of having like a Bank of the United States as like a temporary stopgap to get people back on their feet financially and sort of siphon this money away from the private banking cartel and into the hands of ordinary people, temporarily before we abolish the state. But whatever your solutions are, the Fed in and of itself is a killer of the working class. Inflation is a killer. And inflation can be ended, I believe. It's not an inherent part of living in a modern society. And you don't necessarily have to believe in every aspect of Austrian business cycle theory or right libertarian economics generally to recognize this. And so whenever I hear somebody on the left, fortunately this doesn't happen very often, but whenever I hear somebody say that, oh, abolishing the Fed is just another capitalist plot to impoverish working people at the expense of big business, another Koch brothers plot or something like that, I'm just like, no, the Fed itself is the capitalist plot. Murray Rothbard didn't like the Koch brothers, by the way. Look it up. He really distrusted the influence of huge monetary donors and big financiers in the libertarian movement of his time. And finally, we've got the more direct forms of bribery to big corporations that the average person probably already knows about: lobbying, direct corporate subsidies, and corporate welfare, and the revolving door between the administration of the government and the administration of big business, particularly between business and regulators. I've always also appreciated the argument which a lot of leftists tend to scoff at, unfortunately, the ANCAP argument that we would be better off if people were more free to sue polluting big companies, which there are, I guess, lesser regulations that we could repeal to make that a reality, but I think personally that that would actually require the full repeal of corporate personhood, both in its form before and after Citizens United, and actually going so far as to ban the concept of the corporation in general, in terms of a joint stock company with shareholders. The abolishment of the stock market generally, I think a mutualist society would require these kinds of regulations. And if there are ANCAP societies of the future that sort of scoff at the idea of full workers' ownership, then at least if they don't want to go that far, they should seriously consider enacting those other regulations nevertheless. But there is one particular reform that mutualism is probably most famous for, that you will see prominently displayed in any article written about mutualism, and this reform may be the most revolutionary of all. This is the mutual bank. Simply put, mutual banks are a specific type of bank that would be established by socialist organizations to offer very low-interest loans in order to put more money in the pockets of ordinary workers, and this could be done after a revolution or even in the current system. To quote Kevin Carson again at length, this is probably going to be my longest block quote from him, quote, "In a genuinely free banking market, any voluntary grouping of individuals could form a cooperative bank and issue mutual banknotes against any form of collateral that they chose, with acceptance of these notes as tender being a condition of membership. Benjamin Tucker and William Green usually treated land as the most likely form of collateral, but at one point Green speculated that a mutual bank might choose to honor not only marketable property as collateral, but the pledging of future production. But assuming that the mutual bank limited itself to rendering liquid the property of its members, there would be, strictly speaking, no borrowing at all. Abundant cheap credit would drastically alter the balance of power between capital and labor, and returns on labor would replace returns on capital as the dominant form of economic activity. According to John Robinson, quote, "Upon the monopoly rate of interest for money that is forced upon us by law is based the whole system of interest upon capital that permeates all modern business. With free banking, interest upon bonds of all kinds and dividends upon stock would fall to the minimum bank interest charge. The so-called rent of houses, this is very important, would fall to the cost of maintenance and replacement. All that part of the product which is now taken by interest would belong to the worker. Capital, however defined, would practically cease to exist as an income-producing fund, for the simple reason that if money wherewith to buy capital could be obtained for 0.5%, capital itself could command no higher price. So, perfect bargaining power in favor of the workers against the boss. And the result, as Carson continues, would be a drastically improved bargaining position for tenants and workers against the owners of land and capital. According to Gary Elkin, Tucker's free market anarchism carried certain inherent libertarian socialist implications. Obviously, since Tucker was an anarcho-socialist, but anyway, continuing, quote, "It's important to note that because of Tucker's proposal to increase the bargaining power of workers through access to mutual credit, his so-called individualist anarchism is not only compatible with workers' control, but would in fact promote it. For if access to mutual credit were to increase the bargaining power of workers to the extent that Tucker claimed it would, they would then be able to, 1. Demand and get workplace democracy from their bosses, and 2. Pool their credit and buy and own their companies collectively. Given the workers' improved bargaining position in this regard, capitalists' ability to extract surplus value from the labor of employees would be eliminated or at least greatly reduced. As compensation for labor approached value added, and with the value of corporate stock consequently plummeting, the worker would become a de facto co-owner of his workplace, even if the company remained nominally stockholder-owned. And of course, I'm in favor of it being officially worker-owned. And if you, Mr. ANCAP, listening to this, truly claim to believe in self-ownership, that everyone is entitled to the fruit of their labor and the sweat of their brow, well then you should learn about surplus value theory and exploitation, and support co-ops as a way for people to truly have a say in what they do on a day-to-day basis, and truly own the fruits of their labor, without any ruling class of self-appointed experts, nominally public or private, getting in the way of that. But finally, to conclude, near-zero interest rates would increase the independence of labor in all sorts of interesting ways. For one thing, anyone with a 20-year mortgage at 8% now could, in the absence of usury, pay it off in 10 years. Most people in their 30s would own their houses free and clear. Between this and the non-existence of high-interest credit card debt, two of the greatest sources of anxiety to keep one's job at all costs would disappear. In addition, many workers would have large savings and disposable income now, as significant numbers would retire in their 40s or 50s, cut back to part-time, or start their own businesses, with jobs competing for workers instead of the other way around. So all of that very long discussion of mutual banking I took with some modifications for clarity from Chapter 5 of Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, Kevin Carson's 2007 book, which, along with his 2001 essay, The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand, is often credited with inaugurating the modern mutualist movement. Alongside that particular source, probably the most lucid exposition of mutual banking is to be found in Gary Elkin's essay Mutual Banking, which Kevin himself quoted from a little bit in just that chapter there. An anarchist FAQ, which is a truly tremendous effort over many years and was the one thing to personally make me an anarchist at the age of 14, also goes into surprisingly much further detail than even Kevin Carson. So check out Section G of the FAQ, as well as Section J.5.5 for more mutual banking knowledge. There is a fairly well-known full-length book called Mutual Banking, which was put out by Benjamin Tucker's successor, William B. Greene, who I mentioned in passing, but that is a lot more dense and not as clear as any of the other sources I just mentioned. By the way, those two Kevin Carson works, The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand and Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, alongside Gary Elkin's essay Mutual Banking, those aren't the only mutualist works I think you should read. Those are just the works that I'm aware of that go over the functioning of mutual banks specifically. If you're watching this now, you're watching the significantly revamped and edited version of the Introduction to Mutualism video in comparison to the admittedly very rough original version from 2021. I'm going to delete the original version and upload this one at the same time as another video that I'm uploading, going over which works of mutualist theory and related works that I think you should read, and in what order I think you should read them. If you happen to have watched the original version of this video first off, congrats, you're a real one. Then I did mention that in that version that I would be uploading the reading list video, and I hope you enjoy the reading list video regardless if you are a longer time viewer of the channel or a newer one. And also, mutual banks are a radical socialist proposal for loan banking. All of this doesn't really touch on deposit banking and the functioning of banks and currency in a free society more generally. I think that this is something that all free market anarchists, both mutualists and ANCAPs, have spent precious little time on compared to other things. how would currency actually work in a free society where there is no central bank? Now, the general terminology that most people will use is called free banking, which was a term that was used in the Carson quotes earlier, basically as a general term for libertarian proposals for banks that would have money being overseen by non-centralized organizations, non-government organizations. But we tend to be far too fuzzy on the details, I think. Would each bank issue its own currency? Would it issue and also mint it on site, or would there be a division between these two aspects? How would standardization slowly over time on a free market proceed? What exactly would the currency be backed with? You can see a number of different proposals for so-called free banking are oftentimes referred to on the screen now, but while they are out there, it seems that for whatever reason most free market anarchists just don't incorporate them into their own ideological framework, at least not to the point where it's a common topic of conversation for whatever reason. Maybe it's just too abstract and far into the future to think about for most people, which I do understand in a sense, but having a functioning currency system in the absence of a central bank, which is the sole method of organizing that for 99% of the world, is pretty important. If any mutualists are listening to this, let me know how you think deposit banking and currency generally would work. Another weak point for mutualism, I think, would definitely have to be housing. The ANCAP proposals for housing are known for, well, not really being that different from what we have now. ANCOMs, on the other hand, will go all the way to the other side of things and say that housing should be doled out according to need by local councils. The mutualist understanding, from what I've managed to gather, like by combining the viewpoints of mutualists that have offered their opinions, which is surprisingly not many, which is kind of the problem, but the mutualist understanding seems to be basically that all current rental housing would now just be awarded to the current tenants, expropriated. And I imagine this would also extend to people who are currently paying off their houses to the bank, since I think we would say that the interest rates that most people are paying are immoral, and also the banks themselves are highly bound up in the state. So it'd be like a confiscation in the homestead principle situation for people with mortgages. If you don't know what that means, then peep the reading list. But anyway, current residents would just occupy their apartments or houses, and larger apartment complexes would have things like maintenance managed collectively by all of the tenants, similar to housing cooperatives in the current system. My problem, though, is one that a lot of capitalists listening to this may have already thought of, being how on earth is the average person supposed to pay cash for an apartment every time now, seemingly if you don't think that renting is okay. And yes, as a mutualist, I agree there are significant privileges to the rich in the current system, which, if they were abolished, would lead to people having significantly more disposable income. I'm not entirely convinced that that would be to the point of just being able to drop an assload of money every few years to buy a new apartment or house. I mean, you could pay on installments in a more traditional sense, where there's no interest, and once you pay for a certain amount of time, you just own that place now outright. But while that certainly would be a huge improvement, it still doesn't really get rid of the psychological alienation argument, the same argument used for workplace democracy, against the hierarchy of the renter and rentee being inherently demeaning and authoritarian. Vosh actually did an interesting segment which is uploaded on YouTube from a stream, with the video title being Decommodify Housing Now, a Vosh Saga. Decommodifying housing is SOCDEM/ML/ANCOM terminology for housing free at the point of purchase, through either tax-funded systems or an ANCOM system of decentralized planning. Vosh puts forward a lot of interesting proposals in that video, which are not anarchist for sure, very SOCDEM/DEMSOC, but are very interesting to think about nonetheless, as not many socialists of the non-anarchist or anarchist variety who talk about decommodifying housing are really able to describe what that would mean. Automation. So really quick. People are so concerned about automation, and we got people proposing a universal basic income to deal with it, or a universal job guarantee. With capitalists, there's a general optimism about automation across the board. They basically think that the market will correct itself, and that those people that lose jobs from automation will eventually find new jobs, and once that initial hurdle is overcome, then everyone will just go about enjoying the fruits of cheaper and more easily made consumer products as a result of automation. See the traditional right libertarian attacks on the original Luddite movement of the early modern era, for an example. Leftists like ANCOMs and Social Democrats take a more nuanced view. Some are very afraid of it and are trying to somewhat mitigate it, or at least recognize that we need to have more of a plan to deal with the employment upheaval, since I think most people would agree that it is never-ending and inevitable and ever-increasing up until a certain point. And that can come from a perspective of a large welfare state in the case of Marxists and Social Democrats, or some kind of non-governmental welfare service in the case of Anarcho-Communists. But in reality, the solution is kind of staring us in the face. If you have a business, then automation only means that you maintain the current workload and increase your productivity, or lower your workload and maintain your productivity. Or, in simpler terms, working less and making the same money, or working the same and making more money, all without the need to lay anyone off, although I think this state of affairs, most importantly, would be easiest to maintain with a cooperative business. In fact, I think that there is an argument to be made that there are aspects of the incentives of hierarchical businesses which would make layoffs from automation much, much more likely to occur. The word mutualism was coined by the French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in the 1840s, but this particular style of economic thinking that I have just outlined goes far beyond just him. I take a Big Tent approach to mutualism, including all of the major thinkers that focused their energy around this one particular idea. This idea that we could have a very free and economically fair society as a result of the implementation of only two things: workers' ownership and the removal of laws and privileges that artificially increase the power of corporations, without having to resort to abolishing currency and markets, as in Anarcho-Communism, or creating massive government welfare state programs. In the modern day, we have Gary Chartier, Roderick Long, Jason Lee Bias, Sheldon Richman, Charles Johnson, and most importantly, Kevin Carson. But the entire history of anarchism and socialism itself is dotted with various important thinkers and writers that have advanced basically the same ideas. Proudhon himself, of course, and his spiritual successor in America, Benjamin Tucker, who are the two most famous, but also William Green, Josiah Warren, Dyer Lum, Voltaire, and de Cleyre, who is probably the most famous female anarchist in history after Emma Goldman, the famous anarcho-communist, and the English philosopher Thomas Hodgkin, who predated Marx by 20 years and roundly rejected Marx's authoritarianism and his anti-currency thinking. We can even find echoes of this idea, the idea that entrenched massive corporations are the enemy of the true free market, in places as varied and unexpected as the writings of David Ricardo, Thomas Paine, and even Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson. Remember the famous quote about crushing in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations from Jefferson. And this is all opened up even more when you include mutualism's stodgier, more conservative, and more rural cousin distributism, which has several different figures, organizations, and texts associated with it as well. It's basically very similar, except it's not wedded to a stateless model necessarily. For more information on distributism, check out my reading list video. Other people often stereotypically painted as being in the exclusively right-wing libertarian camp, but who in fact are a lot more varied in their thinking than you might expect. Karl Hess, Albert J. Nock, a very famous luminary of early 20th century libertarian thought, Samuel Konkin, who was the founder of agorism, which is again often considered to be a capitalist theory, but I mean Konkin, his big thing was this intense focus on self-employment as the thing that was going to liberate people from oppression, and he saw established business interests as getting in the way of that. Franz Oppenheimer, who was actually the West German Chancellor's main advisor, who wrote one of the most influential libertarian works of history in his book The State in 1929, that is one of the most influential rejoinders to Hobbes's theory of the state just naturally arising because people wanted protection from each other, and he equally bitterly derided Locke, who took a similar ahistorical, sort of airy philosophical view of how the state arose historically, with his social contract views. So not only is mutualism a fully formed ideology with many important documents and ideological proponents throughout its almost 185-year history, it's also intently focused on strategy, practicality, and outreach to people all across the political spectrum. So the mutualist says to the anarcho-capitalist, you don't have to defend Walmart. You don't have to defend McDonald's or the old 19th century robber barons, or any of these other businesses. Most of them depend on government privileges to survive anyway. You don't have to sneer at and try to explain away genuine issues and concerns leftists have with the present system. Instead, you can say to the leftists that criticize the idea of the market, we understand where you're coming from. Income inequality is a really big deal, but we can reach a new form of society that doesn't have these massive corporations that are doing all these things that you don't like. And to the Anarcho-Communists, the Mutualist says, we see that you're concerned about inequality and businesses getting away with doing corrupt things, but we don't have to do away with markets and currency. We can have the workers own the means of production and make sure that massive concentrations of wealth will not reappear among these new worker co-ops, because getting rid of corporate personhood and limited liability will keep inequality down. The new mutual banking system will keep inequality down, removing patents will help keep inequality down, transportation subsidies, and so on and so forth. Once we recognize that we can achieve a very egalitarian society without sacrificing individual freedom, we open up the floodgates to gather together the widest section of the American public together under one movement against the elites. Conservative rural whites marching arm in arm with urban blacks, hipsters in Brooklyn fighting side by side with Midwestern traditional Catholics that have now started to realize that their goals, at least in terms of the economy, are not all that different. Most ordinary people that aren't genuine psychopaths want less corporate control of the economy, but without sacrificing individual freedom. They also want everyone to have access to health care, although they may or may not want higher taxes to pay for it. And I think that if anarcho-socialists put as much effort into outreach to the general public as they do just constantly battling the evil right-wingers, the idea of workplace democracy as well as anti-landlord sentiment would start to become an everyday topic of conversation around the water cooler for Americans of all backgrounds, as it is slowly more and more now. For more on strategy, see my reading list video. I think it'll prove productive to conclude my talk by discussing a very specific topic, since I know if I don't bring it up now, someone will bring it up in the comments eventually. The topic that you'll notice if you have more exposure to the internet mutualist community as time goes on, which bogs down every online discussion and has since the very beginning of the modern internet mutualist community. These are my definitions regarding property. Now, it may be surprising, given that I am a mutualist, which is a form of anarcho-socialism, and I consider myself an opponent of capitalism and a supporter of workplace democracy, but the semantic framework and the definitions that I use regarding property are closer to the ANCAP understanding. Basically, I believe that private and personal property are synonymous. Your toothbrush is your private property, and so is your house. If you're self-employed, then your mechanic shop is your private property, and if you're part of a co-op, that co-op is the private property of all the workers of that co-op simultaneously. I believe, echoing Walter Block, and believe me, there's not a lot I agree with Walter Block on, that it is impossible for something not to be private property. A national park is the private property of the United States federal government, even though everyone here would agree that this is a particular example of an illegitimate property claim over a certain geographical area. None of what I just said contradicts my commitment to workplace democracy. I just take private and personal property as synonymous, because that's what makes the most sense to ordinary people, and instead I prefer to reframe it as opposing private ownership of the means of production specifically, as well as a dominance of housing control by landlords, but not private ownership of anything else. So if you spend more than 5 minutes talking to anarcho-communists or my fellow mutualists, you will quickly see that they are in agreement when it comes to rejecting my particular reframing of the definitions, even though our views on this issue are very similar. They will tell you something different, that private property specifically refers to the means of production, or to landlord-owned rental housing, both of these things, and that ordinary possessions, your car, your toothbrush, and so forth, are an entirely different category called personal property, or sometimes just called personal possessions. Why is this the case? Well, I posit two reasons. One is that the average European peasant had very little experience with the idea that someone could own a decent amount of consumer goods and not be some kind of exploitative aristocrat lording over a landed estate, or a factory, or a castle of the nobility of some kind, and even less aware that someone could be a self-employed artisan or a yeoman farmer and own his own means of production, without being an employer. And so Proudhon, when he kicked off the anarchist movement in 1840 with What is Property, he followed the definitions of property that most Europeans at the time would be most likely to understand, but not so much the Americans. And in a way also he was sort of echoing common viewpoints of socialist intellectuals in Europe at the time as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were right. Many people who have studied political philosophy for a good while will be aware of an old-school definition of property that comes from Roman law, and is still utilized today in many contexts. That property is a thing, an item, a building, a piece of land, what have you, that a particular person or small group of people have the exclusive right to use and dispose of as they see fit, with the particular parameters of this defined by the legal system in your local area, or else by some abstract theory of property. In my view, this is a perfectly reasonable definition, and there's no reason why we need to jettison it. It only makes people more confused to specifically define property as being synonymous with a particular subcategory within the concept of property, that being the means of production in a hierarchical business or landlord-owned rental housing. I've had mutualists defending this archaic European socialist semantic framework try to tell me that they're really just referring to the standard Western legal concept of real property versus personal property. But that just falls apart. They're both property according to the mainstream legal definition. So why is one of them actually property, according to you, but one of them isn't, and is just actually possessions? Why not just talk, instead, about legitimate property versus illegitimate property? And if it turns out that the idea of bosses owning large companies and telling workers what to do is a form of illegitimate property, as you and I already agree it is, then so it is. To reiterate my main position, which I put forward near the beginning of this section, all property is private property, whether it is one person owning a business or one person owning a toothbrush. Defining private as being a thing that one person can control does not mean that I think that both of those two examples are legitimate. They're not. Only the second one is legitimate. I mentioned earlier that I think co-ops are the private property of all of the workers communally, in a sense. You could sort of rephrase that and say that it is actually communal property instead of private property. I don't think it's really important either way. The only situation where I think the concept of collective or communal property, which I think are synonymous terms, by the way, the only place where I think those terms are unequivocally applicable, as opposed to just talking about co-ops, is in regards to certain things that particularly very large numbers of people in different communities in a wider geographical span need to have continuous access to. Rivers, oceans, the air, wilderness areas, and so on. No smaller subsection of people, whether that be a single person or even a small group of co-ops, can justify centralized control in those cases, because those are the common patrimony of at least all of the communities which are somewhat nearby to those areas, if not the common treasury of all humankind, depending on your view. For more on this, I highly recommend the short YouTube video entitled The Industrial Revolution and Early Anarchism by the YouTube channel Decentralism, which, while it definitely has an ANCAP bias, that video, while it didn't sort of create my view on this issue, I definitely held these views for a good while before I saw it. It definitely helped me to refine my arguments a bit. The other argument I want to put forward has to do with another semantic definition advocated by, but not probably originally conceived of by, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon believed that you could have a legitimate claim on land and buildings needed to live, i.e. business and dwelling places and housing, if you were actually occupying and using that land on a regular basis, i.e. occupancy and use property standards or usufruct property standards, what have you. Now, this immediately leads to a deluge of people from all across the political spectrum crying out in unison, "What, you mean someone can just come in and use my house while I'm at work?" Now, of course, we'll all say no, but the arguments that we have to put forward in order to explain this are normally pretty convoluted and are not convincing to a lot of people with more traditional views on property. And so, as a result of this, I don't talk about occupancy and use either, just like I don't talk about private property and personal property. Because, again, if you believe in the particular semantic framework, as I do, that says that your house is your own private property, and so is your toothbrush, and so is the employer with his pizza shop, if you're in a capitalist system, and all of those but the last one are legitimate instances of genuine property according to mutualism, as I've tried to show, that entire framework that I've put forward doesn't invalidate workplace democracy, doesn't invalidate the concept of the workers seizing the means of production. But what can we learn from Proudhon's advocacy of occupancy and use standards for legitimate property? I think that the main reason why he pushed this was to use it to formulate a specific argument and plan of attack against hierarchical businesses and for workplace democracy. Basically, the capitalists aren't really spending the time using all of the machinery in the workplace, and they're not doing nearly enough work to justify the outsized level of control that they have. And in the most extreme examples, they may be hundreds of miles away in some other office somewhere. So, while I think occupancy and use as a semantic construct to apply to the entire future society is unhelpful, especially when we think about the massive diversity in different property norms and economic systems that would prevail in a free society outside of our own communities, I do think Proudhon uncovered something interesting when he first proposed the idea. As a result of this, I've done some thinking, and I think that the main differences between anarcho-socialists and anarcho-capitalists are a lot more specific than most realize, and can be narrowed down to 4 things. 1. ANCAPs would say that the administrative work that the boss engages in day to day does constitute real work, even if it's not the same type and physical intensity as what some other workers might be engaged in. ANSOCs would disagree. 2. ANCAPs would also justify the boss's position by pointing out that they were the ones to actually acquire the building and equipment from someone else, and so it's rightfully his, and the workers don't have the right to expropriate it. 3. To the average supporter of capitalism, the idea that the capitalist makes his profit by paying workers less than what it costs to produce the goods and services, and that it's exploitation, doesn't make sense. After all, to capitalists, it's just a part of how it works. It's the cycle of production and distribution. Capitalists are holding up their part of the deal by providing the society at large with goods and services, and providing workers with a job. Capitalists need to store some money away to continue improving the business, and this is what the purpose of profit is. Obviously, workers in a cooperative setting would need to do the exact same thing in order to keep their businesses running, and seemingly quite a lot of people on both sides don't tend to recognize this. Not every single penny of the surplus can be distributed as wages, and so the problem isn't so much that the surplus at the end of the day exists, it's just a question of who is the legitimate person or group of people that can allocate it. The socialists would say the workers as a whole, and the capitalists would say the boss, or the administration. This is the main reason why I never really thought that the labor theory of value was really that important, even though I've been a socialist for 17 years, since there's going to be a disconnect between the quote-unquote value of the labor and their wage regardless. And finally, number 4, the deferred consumption argument. This argument isn't as common as the other 3 these days, but it's worth mentioning. This capitalist argument goes basically, the capitalists are those particularly skilled and intelligent people that are willing to put in the time and energy to start a business, and deal with the financial instability in their own lives that would come in the first few years of the business getting off the ground. The worker, on the other hand, is simply the person that has taken the easy way out and decided to work in a subordinate position. And the supporters of capitalism don't see that as an accusatory sort of thing. It's only natural, according to them, that most people won't have the wherewithal to go into business for themselves. It's never questioned why everywhere around the world seems to be dealing with the same set of terrible options, where there are no places in which it is particularly easy to start a business, as ANCAPs must agree, and almost everyone is forced to work for a boss, or else go live in the woods or go on the dole. It's never questioned why the only alternative to breaking the cycle of employment and reliance on a boss is to take on an enormous level of financial risk, with anxiety-filled nights wondering if it was all worth it because the numbers aren't adding up, and you might be in a worse financial position than you were before, because, as we all know, most businesses fail. Why not just share that risk among your fellow workers? So, as a result of this, continuing with number 4, I think that if around 60% of the workers in a given business want to literally kick the boss out, lock him out of the shop, and say, "This is our cooperative now," they should be allowed to do so. At the end of the day, I still do believe in seizing the means of production, not just buying the means of production or outcompeting the means of production or whatever, despite my advocacy earlier in this video for lots of things that could be interpreted as being electoral reforms or more gradualist proposals. And maybe if the workers in question do it in a particularly friendly, non-accusatory way, they can convince the boss to stay on and lend his knowledge and skills to the others on an equal footing. But maybe that won't always be possible. But it's not about armed tough guys with Circle A armbands arresting anyone who tries to create a hierarchical employment situation. I want to create a society in which anyone who suggests creating something like that would be laughed out of the room and no one would want to take them seriously, and take them up on their offer of employment, because there are so many other options for living a more free, self-actualized life in a co-op or a self-employed situation. And if some people did think it the best option to take someone up on an offer of hierarchical employment temporarily, eventually the workers would leave, as well as the very likely scenario as well of the workers simply deciding that it's the right time to take back their surplus value and kick out the middleman. If I had my way, I would make these 4 topics an important part of any future debates between socialists and capitalists, at least of the anarchist variety, that you could ever find. And with that, I'll leave it for now. I hope you all enjoyed, and have a wonderful rest of your day.